This episode, and others like it, are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. In some other news, I recently started a podcast with Hakeem and Ugopnik. It's called The Deprogram, and it's a show dedicated to helping listeners shake off the capitalist programming we've all been subjected to over the years. We tackle all sorts of topics, from theory to current events to culture, and just generally have a good time. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to check it out by following any of the links below. If you're neither left nor right, then you're definitely on the right.
I have done the math. It's not left, it's not right, it's forward, and that is how we're going to beat Donald Trump in 2020.
But tonight I say we must move forward, not backward, upward, not forward, and always twirling, twirling, twirling towards freedom.
Yeah! Hello, Short Kings and ABBA karaoke enthusiasts. Today we're talking about the guy most well known for his fun hat, no hand, and maltreated strip of buckskin shoelace? Ooh, boy. It's Napoleon Bonaparte. There's only ever one good reason to talk about this guy who I just learned was afraid of cats, possibly, and the bad news is that reason is fascists. I know. So why Napoleon? Well, because just like Adolf Sax and Ferdinand von Zeppelin, Napoleon Bonaparte also gave his name to a repulsive load of hot air. Bonapartism. And just because I know you're barely able to hold in your excitement for the part of the video I spend on definitions, I'll get right to it. Bonapartism is, well, it's complicated. For some literalists, Bonapartism is the political movement to get somebody from the Bonaparte family to be ruler of France again. But because literally nobody cares about that, Bonapartism is usually used to mean a system of government that is authoritarian, centralized, and based on popular consent of the central ruler by plebiscite, a kind of public referendum of approval. The goal of the Bonapartists is usually to restore a king-like figure that, for political reasons, they'd rather call president, consul, or back in the old days, emperor. In any case, a single guy who gets to decide everything by appealing to the fact that, hey, you guys think I'm pretty great, right? And since you all love me, why don't you just let me decide everything? Is that crazy? Am I being too goofy? Anyway, democracies drool, Bonapartists rule. Pretty importantly, these leaders get their legitimacy by appealing as unifiers, who unite the people above their left-right or even class divisions. Oppressors and oppressed united under one roof, usually to create a united front against an outside enemy, foreigners and that kind of scapegoating. Unsurprisingly then, Bonapartism is characteristically xenophobic. By its reactionary nature, in seeking to re-establish a sort of monarchy, it's also characteristically far-right. Keep that in mind for later. In any case, the long story short is that Bonapartists want a well-loved and sometimes even an elected king. And if that sounds weird, it's because I haven't even gotten to the secret part of the video where I give you even more definitions. That's right, you're getting more definitions! Oh, go on, you're allowed to be excited. I know definitions are like Christmas gifts under the Maslow hierarchy of needs for you people. Alright, enough fun, let's get on with it. A monarchy, from the Greek monos and archi, meaning only and power, is when one person rules and decides for a political thing, like a country or a group of people or something. Basically, what that guy says goes. An oligarchy, from the Greek oligos meaning few, is when a small minority rules and decides. Finally, a democracy, from the Greek demos meaning people, and kratos meaning state or power, is when every citizen holds political power. Every citizen holding political power, by the way, doesn't just mean voting. It means deliberating, debating, and deciding as a collective. Today, we'd call that direct democracy. But for much of political history, the word democracy on its own referred to direct power like this. This is usually why, at various points in history, you'll find a lot of people who really didn't like the idea of democracy, like founding father James Madison, who was very keen on, quote, refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may discern the true interest of their country, lest they get wicked ideas like abolishing debts or equal divisions of property. Stupid democratic ideas like that. But I'm getting distracted. Basically, just because you vote and participate in elections doesn't mean you live in a democracy, at least not by this definition, which, for the record, is as arbitrary as any other. You can have an elected monarchy or an elected oligarchy, a democracy is just something else. Just for fun, you could call something like our American Republican government, with its weak Congress and powerful single ruler at the top, a monarchy with democratic characteristics. That is, if you have a very boring definition of fun. Anyway, why does this matter? I don't know yet. It's a secret for later. Keep watching. Let's go back to Bonapartism for a second. The goal of Bonapartists is usually easy to understand, but hard to find. Okay, what do I mean by that? Finally, we actually get to the title of the video. There's another part of the Bonapartist definition I've been holding out on giving you. Bonapartism works because it's confusing. Bonapartist politicians, both those who actually embrace the label and those who prefer to hide it a bit more, have a pretty specific strategy for muddying the waters on politics, pretending like there's no such thing as the left and the right, but only strategically in order to usher in a more reactionary, or at the very least conservative, political program, cloaked in the symbols of progressive politics. Let's take a little trip to France to see what we're talking about. Ah, très bien, une baguette. French people love Napoleon. Here's French President Emmanuel Macron commemorating him on the 200th anniversary of his death. And here's far-right presidential candidate Marine Le Pen making him a fan cam for his death day. Just listen to that swelling orchestra. Could almost make me tear up. But I won't. That's called professionalism. Okay, why show these clips? Well, these very same politicians are the ones who will use the messaging of the neither left nor right slogan for their own political interests. Neither left nor right has been Le Pen's strategy since 2015.
Nous engageons tous les patriotes de droite et de gauche à nous rejoindre. Nous formons...
And here's a room of Macron supporters chanting at the same time. The president's own quirky, unique way of saying he is at the same time from the left and the right of the political spectrum. Now, it's obvious to most people that Le Pen is a far-right candidate, and that Macron's presidency has been one of right-wing liberalism. What with the cutting taxes on the wealthy, violently beating down protests, and abusing executive powers to force through legislation. Classic right-wing authoritarian stuff. So then, why are they so keen on telling us they're neither left nor right? The obvious answer is because they're lying and abusing a political system that offers little to no accountability once you're in power. But there's more to it than that. The point is that a lot of French politicians really dig Napoleon, but most importantly, they especially like his strategy. Napoleon, and later his nephew Napoleon III, were masters of counter-revolutionary and anti-democratic reactionary politics, but were also very skillful propagandists. They were both incredibly capable when it came to convincing the masses that rallying behind a single leader above the left-right worker-owner divide was better than continuing with the messy and difficult exercise of democracy and revolution. This leader could claim to be above the left and the right, but then, of course, use his power solely for right-wing policies and turning back the gains made by the revolutionaries, like universal suffrage, the abolition of slavery, and the nationalization of labor. In the spirit of, quote, defending the Republic, and making that very clear by celebrating it with all of its symbols like the blue, white, and red French flag and the revolutionary anthem La Marseillaise, Napoleon cut down the gains made by French revolutionaries over time and de facto reinstituted the monarchy, overturning the revolution's most central victory. Basically, left-wing symbols, but right-wing politics. Both leaders were able to use the revolution's comparatively more democratic institutions for their own benefit to turn around and tyrannize foreigners and their own people. Specifically, Napoleon I pushed his way into office with a coup, but then leveraged his support from the French people as a famed military general to go from first consul to first consul for life, and finally emperor, all with a massive amount of public support. His nephew did the same thing, first as president of the Second French Republic, then seizing power in a coup d'etat and calling himself emperor. Both leaders became dictators, all the while constantly evoking the spirit of the revolution and the defense of the Republic which they had themselves destroyed. These were men who conquered, who warred, who controlled all organs of the press, who stripped women of their rights, who reinstated slavery by brutally repressing slave revolts, and who disempowered the parliaments. Generally speaking, Bonapartism takes all the ways in which people previously expressed their political power through local governments, associations, unions, parliaments, revolutions, basically any semblance of democracy, and thins out politics until all that's left is the quasi-universal support of the great, enlightened leader who unites the nation. It is a politics of strength, of peace by force, of law and order, and of deeply reactionary logic. Ultimately, it is a politics based on deferring authority and decision to powers above the democratic body. There's the way in which that's literally happening with the nation's single leader with all the power, but there's also the more metaphorical way this happens behind the scenes. Markets are a great example of this kind of power above democracy. Both Macron and Le Pen, though different in their execution, are both ultimately allowing markets to decide what the correct way to organize society is. These leaders are more than happy to delegate the power they are granted upwards to let market forces ultimately be the way by which politics are decided. For Macron, it's the classic neoliberalism of the third way politicians that preceded him, like Bill Clinton in the US and Tony Blair in the UK, basically letting international markets run loose, deregulating and privatizing all over the place, and fixing things when they inevitably go wrong with austerity politics. For Le Pen, it's the same thing but with domestic, not international capital markets, relying on French capitalists to just treat their employees better, because they're both French, and that's what matters at the end of the day. It shouldn't be surprising to learn that that does not happen. Back when it was the two Napoleons doing this, there was a guy who looked at what was happening and said, "Man, this blows." In his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx saw all of this unfolding in real time, figured out what Bonapartism was about, and correctly identified that the French peasantry, disunited and without common interest, happily accepted the all-powerful sovereign, but that it was ultimately the French bourgeoisie, divided among itself and unable to rule effectively, that gave up its crown to save its purse. It gave the powers of the executive to a popular leader that would leave them alone, free to exploit the French working class that had started making too many gains during the first two republics, so that they, the upper class, could keep making their profits. That's the purpose of neither left nor right discourse, a way to unite people behind one guy or one idea that'll take politics and democracy out of their hands and into the hands of a few capitalists. We don't hear about it as much here in the US, but Yang's platform gives us an idea of what it could be like. Andrew Yang's not some far-right authoritarian. Nothing about him really gives us that idea of a vaguely fascistic unifying leader the way a Le Pen or a Macron can be, despite whatever this is.
Yang Yang 2020. Yang Yang 2020.
But Yang is still applying the same principles as the Bonapartists with roughly similar goals. He's using this idea of unifying the left and the right, getting rid of all the silly polarization and commotion of political life, to give more power to markets and what he calls human-centered capitalism. He's using a universal monthly check as a permission slip for capitalists to do whatever they feel is fair. Workers be damned. Deregulate and privatize everything, including social safety nets. Let the market do what it wants. Just toss back enough crumbs that people won't want to change things themselves or have an actual place at the table. If he can present himself and his very conventional neoliberalism as the politics of change, and turn around and cast the quote extremism of the left wing of the Democratic Party as nothing more than political stagnation, that's all the better for him. He's defending democracy while turning back the clock on its gains, not for any personal political power, but for that of capital markets. And if you're thinking I forgot about the guy who I literally cannot make a joke about without sounding like Colbert, Trump's strategy wasn't very different. His was just more personal, more closely related to the imagery of kings and monarchs, based on an appeal to an imaginary nation that never existed except in some racist white guy's fantasies. That distinction doesn't make him substantially different. It was still just a way to let the wealthy do whatever they want in the background. But it's what prompted a lot of observers to analyze him with the Bonapartist model, though usually stopping short and using the more in vogue populist label. And here we find part of the reason why some people who talk about populism can get politics so wrong. Equating someone like Sanders to someone like Trump makes a lot less sense than equating a Trump and a Yang. Because even if both Trump and Sanders are both known for bold, loud personalities and a very vocal grassroots support, their politics are so radically different in the way they treat democracy and what people want that putting them on the same level misses the point entirely. Yang isn't a populist really, but it doesn't necessarily matter. Trump and Yang, like Napoleon's the First and Third, have figured out that people think democracy stops at the ballot box. These people are perfectly happy with a system that gets them public support and lets them use it to act as protectors of the capitalist economy. An economy that lets the few people who own entire industries decide for the rest of us what's right and what's wrong. That is not what democracy is. Democracy is not just letting your favorite guy do whatever, especially not if that means giving power to a wealthy group of capitalists to continue exploiting you. That's not democracy, that's Bonapartism. Be vigilant. Remember that just because a politician waves around revolutionary symbols, that does not make them a friend of the people. If they're neither left nor right, you better believe you're gonna see 100% right-wing policies. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Thanks to viewers like you, I've not only been able to keep up my weekly videos, but also start a new podcast with 2 other great YouTubers. Hakeem Ugopnik and I started the Deprogram because there was a real lack of a truly international socialist podcast. And what better way to fix that than having 3 socialists from 3 different parts of the world come together to discuss our unique perspectives on important topics. That, and it's just fun to hang out and talk commie stuff for an hour or so each week. We just passed the 20 episode mark, so you'll have plenty of fun topics to choose from, like how to win people over to the left, the failures of past socialist experiments, and of course, debunking some of the most common anti-communist talking points. If you'd like to help support the podcast, join our Discord, and get early access to every episode, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thedeprogram. Otherwise, you can catch 1 episode per week absolutely free on all your favorite podcast platforms or right here on YouTube. So check out the Deprogram by following any of the links below. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.